Good evening. Hello. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Council. My name is Sam Feist. I'm the Washington Bureau Chief at CNN. And before I introduce our special guests, I'll remind you this is an on-the-record evening, so many Council events are off the record, but this one is an on-the-record evening. Please do us a favor and turn off your BlackBerries or cell phones before we forget. And I've been asked to offer this reminder about an event here tomorrow. The Council is pleased to announce a meeting tomorrow entitled Aging Americans, Challenges and Innovations for Foreign Policy and the Private Sector. So please join if you can.
You're still alive?
On that note, I'd like to introduce a person who really needs little introduction here at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Brzezinski is, of course, a counselor and trustee at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. You all know that he was the National Security Advisor to President Carter, an author of a new book, Strategic Vision, America and the Crisis of Global Power, and you'll have an opportunity to purchase this book after the event tonight. Perhaps most importantly to me, he's the father of a friend of mine, a person that I started my term membership at the Council on Foreign Relations with, who is now, of course, was just installed as the United States Ambassador to Sweden, Mark Brzezinski. So that might be the most important piece of your biography. So congratulations on Mark's success as well, Dr. Brzezinski.
And it ages me.
Yes. So the way tonight will work is Dr. Brzezinski and I will spend a little bit of time, maybe a half an hour, talking about some issues in the news, issues of interest to me and to Dr. Brzezinski, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions yourself, and so there'll be a microphone, and you can find the microphone. So keep those questions, think about those questions as we chat. I want to talk about a few subjects in the news. And it could almost be question roulette, but I want to talk about Iran first, and then we'll get to Russia. Do you think, what's your gut instinct? If the United States does nothing, do you think Israel will do something? Do you think Israel will take action?
If the United States does nothing, Israel might take action. If the United States does something, Israel might decide not to do something. In other words, we're not just spectators. We're not indifferent. We're also not likely to be unaffected if something does happen. So first of all, I would say the United States, in my view, should make it clear that it would not be compatible with our good relationship if something was started that ends up being very difficult for us. But let's face the realities of that conflict, if it develops. Iran's capacity to retaliate against Israel is relatively limited by geography and by the nature of the arms available currently to the Iranians. But if the Israelis do something, and we apparently did nothing, or we're just, nodding gravely, or even shaking our head but doing nothing, then the Iranians will certainly conclude that we connived in it, and especially if it's done through Iraq. So they'll retaliate against us. And just think of the options they have. And the chances are that none of them are so decisive that they would just pursue a single one. They're more likely to pursue several at the same times. One, make life miserable for us in Western Afghanistan, which is relatively peaceful. They have means, they have access, they're right there. And the Hazaras would be where the Iranians would make life miserable for us, therefore making a withdrawal a steady, reliable type of a withdrawal that we're planning, very difficult. They can certainly destabilize Iraq, and particularly mobilize the Shiite elements in Iraq, thereby create a connection with Syria. I mean, we could have a much larger conflict on that axis. They could certainly do something in the Strait of Hormuz, which at the very minimum would significantly increase the price of oil, with economic consequences for us that are very damaging. They could do some things also in northeast Saudi Arabia to the oil fields where the population tends to be Shiite. In brief, the consequences for us could be quite serious. I think that means, to me at least, that we have a real national interest in giving the peace process a real chance, a real chance, and not something that operates under deadlines set by somebody else. And let's see if we can make an agreement. And if we can't, we can do at least two things. One, give a clear-cut guarantee to all the countries in the Middle East, including Israel, very much, that any threat from Iran, not to mention even an act of war, would be viewed as directed against the United States. Look, that kind of a guarantee by the United States has a solid 100% record of reliability. We have protected Japan and South Korea from North Korea on that basis, and neither one of them is pleading for a war against North Korea. We defended our allies in Europe for 40 years during the worst days of the Cold War, very threatening days of the Cold War, and nothing happened. So deterrence does work. So first of all, that's one option. Secondly, if for some reason there was evidence that the Iranians are seeking a large-scale nuclear program with weaponry, we could go to the Security Council and ask for approval for action against Iran from China and from Russia included.
You think we would get it?
Probably not. But if we don't get it, isn't that a significant message to us? That we're no longer the unilateral policeman of the world? I think these are the kinds of things we have to think about and talk about seriously and calmly, and without hype and without too much emotion, but with a sense of responsibility.
What if they were to get a nuclear weapon before the US or Israel took action? So imagine for a moment that we are in a world where Iran has now tested a nuclear weapon. How destabilizing is that? Fareed Zakaria last week said, you know, it might not be so bad. It might not be destabilizing at all. It might actually be stabilizing.
Well, first of all, I don't understand, frankly, what you're talking about, because how can you have a nuclear weapon without having nuclear explosions that tested?
I'm just saying, if you have a nuclear, if Iran becomes a nuclear capable power.
I don't know what nuclear capable is. It either has them or doesn't have them.
They have them.
Well, that means they have had to test it.
Okay.
After testing it, they have to weaponize it, and they have to have a delivery system. In other words, there are time sequences here. So it doesn't become weapons capable all at once.
No.
There are stages and stages. We have plenty of time.
So?
And during that time, we can make it very clear that if they use that weapon to threaten anyone, it is as if they were threatening us. And that is a system of deterrence that has worked reliably for decades. There's no argument to the contrary, because it has, except one extremely silly argument, that somehow or other the Iranians are messianic. They want desperately to commit suicide. A course of action which apparently hasn't occurred to them in the course of 3,000 years of their history. But all of a sudden now they want to be messianic. You know who's messianic? Netanyahu, because he talks that way. And that's a very risky position. This is why I favor the position that most Israelis have, which this should not be done. Public opinion polls in Israel are very clear that the majority of Israelis don't want that to happen.
A strike.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're less concerned if Iran were to
Well,
gain
why should
that
I
power.
be so concerned if I dealt with the Soviet Union, which had 4,000 weapons, and I remember being woken up one night at 3 a.m. to be told by my military assistant that we're under nuclear attack. It obviously didn't happen since we're all here. There would have been 85 million Americans and Soviets dead 6 hours later.
All right, I want to talk about...
We deterred them. If we can deter the Soviet Union, if we can deter North Korea, why on earth can't we deter Iran?
You just gave me an opening to talk about Russia, but before we talk about the Russia issues of the day, if you wouldn't mind, because I think there are people here who might be interested in it, talk about that phone call. I've heard that there was a phone call, but I don't know anything else other than the fact that you got the phone. What's it like to get a call at 3 o'clock, and what happened, and what went through your mind?
I don't want to hype it, so I'm not going to go into all the detail, but let me just
go into a little detail.
A little bit of an answer. Part of my job was to coordinate the response if something like that happened, to notify the president. I had 3 minutes in which to notify him. During those 3 minutes, I had to confirm it in a variety of ways. And then he would have 4 minutes to decide how to respond. And then 28 minutes later, some of us would be dead, and we'd be living in a different age. I got a message from my military assistant general, who simply woke me up at 3 a.m. at night on the red phone and said, "Sorry to wake you up, we're under nuclear attack." Okay. That kind of wakes you up.
Yep.
And he adds, 30 seconds ago, 200 Soviet missiles have been fired at the United States. 200. Well, that's an interesting number because that means it's a selective counterforce strike, which means that the presidential decision would be a little more difficult. He would have to decide, do we want to respond in a reciprocal fashion? In other words, absorb 200 strikes, presumably directed more against our naval bases, airports, airfields, etc. Do we want to absorb it and respond in kind? Conceivably, although I would not have recommended that, do we want to absorb it and then negotiate, which would be, I think, a rather big mistake? Or do we want to respond accordingly, but plus a little more, to convince them that this is not going to lead to anything good, although 200 strikes is a lot? Or do we want to respond with everything? Just let it roar, and then 85 million dead. Well, anyway, we never got very far because the subsequent confirmations did not confirm it. So,
well, you had 3 minutes to figure this out.
Yeah, well, there were subsequent confirmations, and pretty clearly within actually almost 2 minutes prior to me calling him on the 3rd minute, it was clear that this was false alarm. So I did nothing. I went back to sleep. And the next morning, I went and I told the president what happened in the night, and he got mad at me. And he says, "You should have phoned me," and what the hell, and blah, blah, he was in the Navy. And he was in an SLBM submarine, can fire rockets with nuclear weapons on it. So I told him, "No, Mr. President, the procedure was I have 3 minutes to verify." I got the report, and there was a process of verification. Before the 3rd minute struck, it was clear to me this was a false alarm. So I'm informing you now, which is the procedure that I was supposed to follow, and I did follow. So he kind of grimaced, and then phoned up the Secretary of Defense and asked what the hell was going on here and so forth.
Well, what happened? I mean, how does the National Security Advisor of the United States get a call, say, Dr. Brzezinski, we're under attack, 200 ICBM missiles, 200 warheads or whatever are heading towards the United States. What are you going to do? I mean, it's just like...
Well, I mean, we did do some things, but I'm not going to go into that. We weren't going to be lying down on the ground and waiting to be hit on the head. But, well, it had something to do with an exercise, and there was some sort of a glitch, so that he got alerted. And then the confirmations did not come in. It was very clear, very quickly, that this was just a glitch.
All right, my last question on the subject, then I'll talk about Russia today. What was your recommendation going to be? You had used up 2/3 of your time.
Well, first of all, I may not be asked for a recommendation, but I certainly would have favored commensurate response with maybe a bit of an add-on as an inducement for restraint.